research articles, and they're related to sprint and distance performances. The first study I want to look at, or looked at, was a study done in Switzerland by Knecht et al., and it was based on the fat oxidation at different intensities in wheelchair racing. So basically, the purpose of the study was to examine the ideal intensity for fat oxidation in order to make recommendations for endurance training for wheelchair racing athletes. They had 9 subjects that performed a 20-minute test at different intensities on a treadmill in a lab setting. So the results, as presumed, there was a total energy expenditure. The higher the percentage, the more energy there was expended. However, there was no significant or statistically significant difference between the 3 tested intensities in terms of fat oxidation. So the study concluded that for endurance training, it would be most beneficial to train at a 55% of VO2 peak, because a lower energy, therefore, will allow the athletes to perform a task longer. Obviously, this was a quantitative study. I think there was a high internal validity because we had a lab setting, so all the athletes were tested in the same environment, and the tests were always very controlled. There might be some constraints in terms of external validity, just because, again, there's a treadmill is different than being on the track, for example. We had sufficient subjects. We had 9 subjects, which actually for para is quite a good number, because that's one of the biggest issues we are having with para athletics research, is that we don't get enough subjects. They did a ANOVA T test, or also called the Bonferroni test, to look at the statistical significance at a p-value of 0.05. And if we're looking here on our next slide, we can see a graph. On the top one would be total energy expenditure. The round dots will be our carbohydrate oxidation, and the lowest one would be the square dots will be the fat oxidation. As you can see, with the 2 top ones, the higher the percentage, the higher the energy expenditure, except for fat oxidation stays the same. Good to know for us coaches. If we do prescribe endurance training, we want to keep it at those lower percentages and really make sure that the athletes don't go too hard when we want them to do endurance training. The second research study I'm looking at is a performance diagnostic with an instrumented racing wheelchair. Comparison of 2 different classes of athletes. The purpose was to develop a cheap and flexible instrumentation that could measure velocity, peak power, and other things such as pushing frequency. The results showed that the T53 had twice the maximum velocity and 2 times as much energy over 100 meters compared to a T52. The conclusion was that this instrumentation would be useful and an accurate, cheap system to monitor velocity for wheelchair testing. Just to give you a bit more of a visual, again, here we have a velocity profile. A1 is the T53 versus the A2 T52 athletes, so a significant difference there. I would say in terms of the study, it was a quantitative study again. Some low internal validity because we're using a new instrumentation, so we're not really sure how reliable those numbers are. But that was just part of the research to make this more valid kind of a tool. A better external validity because it was done on a real track, a real environment. Also, what I really like is that we have a comparison between 2 different classes. Definitely gives us some more insights, distinguishing between a 52 and a 53. The third study I want to touch on is analysis of the aerodynamics for a wheelchair racer. This was a case study done in Spain, and they were looking at 3 different seating positions and how that affects the aerodynamics or the drag of an athlete. The results showed significant differences, and the conclusion was that their slight change in head position can actually affect the drag forces by up to 2%. So, just right away from a coaching perspective, that's a very good insight to have. This was a quantitative study. They used a deceleration test in this study. It's also called the Doppler effect. So meaning they're looking at a F statistics, so looking at how quick the athletes were slowing down once they reached a certain speed. There was internal validity. I have some questions because this was done on the outdoor track. We have wind affecting this athlete. So, taking in consideration wind affecting those numbers, probably not the highest validity. External validity, pretty high because we're on the track. It's real world kind of an example there or a study. And again, this can be important for us coaches. Here's just a quick picture of what the different positions were, from being upright to medium to very low with the head down. And that's the deceleration curve over time. Now, again, wind could play a role here, headwind versus tailwind. But it's just a general curve of how quick the athlete slowed down, speed versus time. The fourth study I want to look at here was the locomotor respiratory coupling in wheelchair racing. So meaning what rhythm do athletes breathe when they're doing different distances. They looked at 400, 800, and 5,000 in a lab setting on a training roller. There again, we had 9 subjects in this trial, and they did these 3 different trials, and they were observed in this study. The conclusion was that the findings suggest a higher coupling ratio indicates enhanced breathing, work efficiency with a contaminant deeper and slower respiration during wheelchair racing. So basically, in a nutshell, the longer the races went on, the higher the ratio of breathing in versus stroke frequency. Okay, so for me as a coach, again, this is very valuable to know what frequency an athlete should be pushing at. So at the shorter distances, we're looking at a higher frequency versus at the longer distance with a lower frequency. In terms of, it was a quantitative study, great internal validity. In order to compare those different things, they did a repeated measures one-way ANOVA with a p-value of 0.05. So again, good internal and probably external validity as well. Here are some of the, here's a graph on how the push frequency and the respiratory frequency compare to each other. So you can see a general trend. Of course, there's always some outliers, so it's not always linear, especially when you look at the respiratory frequency. Some athletes who actually kept almost the same frequency for 400 and 800, so not much of a difference, but definitely a significant difference between the 800 and the 5,000 for sure. The last study that I looked at was the heart rate and lactate minimum and maximal lactate steady state. This was done by C. Perret as well at this Swiss Paralympic Training Center. The purpose was to investigate whether heart rate and lactate minimum have a relationship. 8 athletes were tested in this, and the conclusion was that there exists a close relationship between heart rate and the exercise intensity. So what I can conclude out of this was that using heart rate would be a very good way of monitoring the athlete's intensity. And as you can see here, the higher the lactate, the higher the heart rate. The higher the heart rate, the higher the lactate production. In conclusion, there's many factors that contribute to wheelchair racing, and further research needs to be done. All of the studies were quantitative in nature. Personally, I would love to look into research optimal tire pressure